Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 20. I am the host of the show, Kyle Anslow, and I'm joined by the co-host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
What's up, Kyle? How are you doing tonight?
Doing pretty well. Got a lot to talk about on today's show. The Espionage Act, potential violations of the peace deal in Afghanistan, and of course, massive weapon sales to Taiwan, which are sure to fuel the conflict between the U.S. and China. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more in the middle of all that. But for people who want to share the show, you find it online at the Libertarian Institute. Make sure you subscribe to it at your favorite podcatcher. And the way you really help the show and get the most access to the show is really by going to the YouTube channel, subscribing to it there. That way you get the video feed. We'll have this great news ticker on the bottom of the screen, and we display the articles we're talking about to give a little bit more detail about what's going on. So, Will, if you're ready, we'll get into it.
Yeah, let's do it, man.
All right, first up on today's show, we have an announcement by Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who unfortunately is on her way out in the House. She didn't run for re-election, so this January, after that, she won't be returning. And that means I'm not really optimistic that her bill is going to get brought to the House floor or anything, since we got less than a month till the election, no stimulus deal for COVID, which seems to be maybe the top priority for the House, and then not much is I'm guessing is expected to happen in November and December. But this bill nonetheless is being brought up, and hopefully, even if Gabbard isn't bad, somebody like Thomas Massey could pick it up and keep talking about it, because it is just that important. What this bill would do is reform the Espionage Act to better protect whistleblowers. One of the things in the Espionage Act is that you're really not allowed to defend yourself based on what you did. You can't say, well, I did release all these documents, but it was to show there was massive violations to the Constitution, unethical stuff going on, whether it's mass spying or the torture at Guantanamo Bay or elsewhere around the world that the U.S. was doing. And so people like Edward Snowden are essentially forced to either show up to this court, only be able to present evidence that, either you did or did not leak the documents, not as to why you leaked the documents, and then be thrown in jail for the rest of your life. So, Will, let's talk about this a little bit. How important do you think these reforms are, if it were to get passed?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of incredible that a similar reform has not yet been passed. That we still have the Espionage Act in its current form, which they have used to either prosecute or to attempt to prosecute all kinds of whistleblowers. Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, he was charged under that. The charges were eventually dropped because the government misconduct in investigating him. But as you mentioned, the NSA leaker Edward Snowden has been charged under the Espionage Act. Chelsea Manning, who released the Iraq and Afghan war logs, and then of course Julian Assange, who who's the U.S. is trying to prosecute under the Espionage Act for helping Manning to get those documents published. And this law, the Espionage Act, basically treats whistleblowers as enemy spies. That is what the law was designed to do, after all, is to go after people committing espionage. But that's obviously a very different and distinct kind of action from somebody who's trying to reveal secrets for the benefit of the public. That's an entirely different kind of act. And yet under the current law, there is no distinction, really. And as you're saying, they don't allow the accused to really defend themselves. They don't let them state their reasoning for releasing the classified material. And so they're barred from even talking about their intent at all. And so this new thing introduced by Gabbard is, I think, extremely important. It would be a major amendment to the Espionage Act, and it would allow for defendants to speak about their intent, what I think they call a affirmative defense. They'd allow them to give that, which would mean that people like Snowden or Assange could actually speak to the public interest element of their disclosures, should they ever, stand trial in the U.S. And God forbid that does happen. But under this reform, that would allow them to more, give them a greater ability to defend themselves. And obviously that would change a lot about how a jury would hear the case. As under the current law, the government is basically able to paint the picture and characterize things exactly as they want without any pushback from the defendant. So I think that's kind of an insane fact that's the current law. But this bill would also make it so prosecutors would have to prove that people charged under the Espionage Act have a specific intent to cause harm to the U.S. or to help an enemy state with their disclosure. And they would also have to show that the material that was released was properly classified. Meaning, so if it's something that like is illegal for the government to do, they actually have no right to keep that secret. And so that would also now factor into this as like whether it was properly classified. So it does quite a few interesting reforms to the Espionage Act. It also, I think, it tries to strengthen protections for publishers and journalists, and tries to make it so only people who hold a security clearance can be hit with the Espionage Act charges. So that, like, for somebody like Julian Assange, that would make a huge difference because he's being charged purely as a publisher and a journalist. Whereas for somebody like Edward Snowden, he himself, he did hold a security clearance. He was a source. He personally actually got the secrets, but nonetheless, he would still be able to defend himself a lot better under this reform. So there's a lot of things that this does that I think is extremely important, and I think we can see how important it is because people like Daniel Ellsberg have endorsed it and said that like had this been the law when he was charged, like it would have helped him a lot. So I think that says quite a bit about what this reform would do.
Yeah, I believe Edward Snowden has said that as long as he would be able to, testify as to why he did this, he would actually be willing to come and have his trial in the U.S. So, at least from his perspective, this is something that he thinks would be, important to him gain justice. The points about Julian Assange are huge, especially the security clearance thing, just because if you are a publisher, that would essentially, as long as you don't have a security clearance, like maybe in the past, and now you're publishing other works, that seems to like really be something that's going to help the publishers. You also had this interesting thing with Julian Assange, right, where he's not a citizen of the U.S., and so it's kind of curious how he could be violating the Espionage Act by publishing documents given to him by other people. But the U.S. is claiming that he is subject to the Espionage Act, but then at the same time that he doesn't have First Amendment rights, to free speech and free press and to be able to publish and everything, because he's not an American citizen. And it's a way for the U.S. to kind of have it both ways to get who they want, and at the same time pretend like it's not impacting the Constitution. But again, this will kind of just take care of that whole problem. Will, I know I, opened it up being pretty pessimistic about, actually passing anything like this. Do you have any reason to think that this might get taken up, debated at all? Or is it just going to be a bill that kind of sits around until Tulsi Gabbard's out of office, and then likely the, incoming Congress won't pick it back up again? Or if they do, it'll be somebody like Thomas Massey who doesn't have like the clout needed to get his bill brought forward in the House, and they'll just sit around again.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't have any real like detailed insight into like the potential fate of the bill, but I do get the same impression that you do, a more pessimistic one, that this thing will just sort of languish. I mean, Tulsi has been able to get certain like bipartisan. I don't know if you call it a coalition, but like for example, she recently introduced a resolution with the Republican rep Matt Gaetz to call for to drop all charges against Edward Snowden. And so I would like to see her sort of like, team up with people across the aisle and maybe get some momentum behind this thing. But so long as it's her name attached to this and there's not any other bigger names, I don't foresee, especially her fellow Democrats really like playing ball with her for this. I don't think she's very popular among a lot of her, fellow party members. So, I'm not sure how much they would stick their neck out for this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that one, but it's the real thing that's needed to make sure that the American people are able to get the truth about what their government is doing. And just a final point here that Scott Horton always brings up is the way they, are kind of acting with the Espionage Act right now. They're really, kind of saying that the American people are the enemy because that's who this information is important to. It's not that Edward Snowden took a bunch of documents to the Chinese or the Russians to say this is how America might be, intercepting different communications. It's not like Julian Assange got documents and gave them to Al Qaeda or the Taliban or whoever else to help them
Right.
understand what the Americans were doing. This was information given to the American people to understand what our government was doing so we could better, you know, regulate them and try to prevent them from doing some of the just insane mass surveillance, torture program stuff that has gone on in the past 20 years now. And again, if the American people aren't the enemy, then why are they being charged with the Espionage Act for releasing this to the American people? And the way the way Tulsi is looking to change this bill, it seems to be getting back to the original intent of the idea, where if somebody is selling U.S. state secrets to a foreign power to harm the American people, then yeah, there's something wrong with that. But not if it's American citizens or other citizens of the world just publishing and leaking information about crimes committed by the American government.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is a complete abuse of what you would think something called the Espionage Act would be for, and that'd be going after espionage and not after journalists looking out for the public interest. So you'd think there would be some kind of distinction between those things, and maybe there will be if this bill has any luck. But for now, unfortunately, that is not the case.
All right, well, let's take a minute to thank our show's sponsor, Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde offers great CBD products. I've been using some of their products for the past couple of months now, and I gotta say, it's been huge, especially with this recent move I had across most of the country, Boston to Denver. That's thousands of hours in the car, or not hours, miles of driving in the car. Not having most of like my usual stuff like my bed and my comfortable chair to sit in. I gotta say, it's really been helpful with like the back pain and just I have a job where I sit and I read for hours and hours and hours every day, which means that when you're sitting on your butt that much, it's pretty easy to get some soreness and stuff like that. But I really find the CBD, especially the daily gel capsules I'm taking, are huge. And so, check that out if you're somebody who has, just like kind of chronic discomfort and back pain or something like that, or any other thing that the CBD might help you with. If you go to palomaverdestore.com, they got this great CBD education page where they just go through and say, hey, this is how CBD could help you with different things, and hopefully help you pick the right product for you. So again, palomaverdestore.com. When you shop for your CBD there, make sure you put in the promo code PEACE at checkout, and you'll get 25% off your order of $75 or more. Will, let's get back to the show.
All right.
Up next, we have this story on Afghanistan, where the U.S. over the past couple of days has conducted several strikes in the Helmand province. This is in southwest Afghanistan, definitely Pashtunistan, heavy Taliban presence there. And Will, it doesn't seem like these fighters were necessarily violating the peace deal, but the U.S. claims they were and carried out all these strikes, which seemed to me to be a violation of the peace deal. That the Taliban are not necessarily no longer at war with the Afghan government, and so this is probably creating quite a stir in Afghanistan. We also have the talks that are supposed to be going on in Qatar right now between the Taliban and the Afghan government. What do you think of this situation here?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now, I don't think that much is known about the U.S. strikes themselves, like how many they actually did, the number of targets or casualties or anything like that. We just have the DoD spokesperson, which if you're watching the video version of the show, you can see those tweets on the screen from Colonel Sonny Leggett. He basically just said there were several strikes in Helmand, and that is sort of like the Taliban's like stronghold in Afghanistan. It's where they hold a lot of they have the most control and sway in the country. The Afghan government came out separately and claimed that they killed 170 fighters in this whole incident. But I'm always very, we've talked before about their numbers are, not usually very trustworthy. They often will inflate or deflate numbers depending on, what their interest is. However, we do have a statement out from the Taliban, who their spokesperson also came out on Twitter, put out a statement, and he was claiming that they were basically just retaking their own territory that the government had captured from them a couple months prior. And they were saying that like locals in the area had been complaining of like bandits and looters and stuff, which definitely that does happen in Afghanistan. There are like highwaymen and stuff. I'm not sure if like what the spokesperson is saying is legit in this case, but that was their argument for why this whole thing was justified and why this is not any kind of violation of the deal. They're saying this territory was fair and square, belonged to them. They were taking it back. However, like I guess the fact that I would even say this is kind of a good sign, but like these type of strikes by the U.S. like on the Taliban have seemingly become kind of rare nowadays. at least like definitely compared to previous phases of the war. We don't really see the U.S. taking these like retaliatory operations that much, especially since signing the deal with the Taliban in February. Um, and it's kind of weird. Like U.S. officials have repeatedly said that the Taliban has held up their end of the deal in terms of like halting direct attacks on American troops, because that is what they were supposed to do under the agreement. However, the Taliban has definitely not let up on attacking the local Afghan forces, which was not apparently not part of the deal with the Taliban. And they seem to be doing that fairly regularly now, carrying out these attacks, even during the talks in Qatar. Um, and the U.S. Taliban deal does mention something about the Taliban not attacking U.S. allies. And U.S. officials regularly talk about the Afghans as if they're allies. But technically, like, we don't have any kind of mutual defense treaty with them or anything. They're technically not our allies. And so, and like in practice too, Washington has not really been treating them as allies in the sense that like they're not retaliating to attacks on local forces over the last 8 months or so, with only minor exceptions like what we're seeing over the weekend. It's certainly possible the U.S. is like they are carrying out these strikes. They're just not publicizing them. But if they were doing that, you would expect the Taliban to like be talking about that more and complaining about it more. And we're not really seeing that. So I do tend to think they've scaled back the operations. But the provision in the deal, though, about like U.S. allies doesn't seem to apply to the Afghan government. Like that's not how the U.S. has been treating it, for the last 8 months or so. And in that case, I'm not sure how they would justify these strikes in Helmand over the weekend. The DoD spokesperson said that they were consistent with the deal, but he didn't get into how. He didn't really explain that at all. It would seem, though, pretty arbitrary for them just to suddenly decide that the Afghans do count as allies and that we will now start retaliating to any attacks that the Taliban might launch on them, despite taking like a very different stance for several months after a bunch of different Taliban offensives. So I don't really know how they intend to explain any of this. Maybe they won't even try. But I guess I could see them just trying to say that, like, no, we have the right to defend our Afghan partners under the current agreement, even if it doesn't. I don't think it explicitly says that.
Yeah, that seems to was what really caught my attention, was that it doesn't seem that they were able to at least argue that any members of the U.S. forces or our allied like NATO coalition forces that may still be operating in Afghanistan were under threat here. It's not like the Taliban were attacking a new base that houses some kind of international forces, but rather they were just launching an offensive against the Afghan government, which, at least for the first several months of this deal, appeared to be fair game. And so
Right.
why the U.S. would start carrying out strikes to turn them back is curious. Now, I read a statement from the Taliban that said that they were just recapturing territory. When I read the Reuters story on this, they wrote it up as the Taliban were in the midst of an offensive where they were going to take positions that would give them more control around the capital of the Helmand province, Lashkar. And if that were the case, then they could potentially mount an offensive against the city and maybe take the city out. I mean, it's been several years since it seems like the Taliban have really tried to take and hold a big city. They've gone to Kandahar, Farah City, I think Ghani are all like cities they've entered in the past several years, but they've always left like immediately. So I'm not sure what the strategy is here, other than maybe to help protect that city. But in that case, this isn't a part or doesn't really fit within the peace agreement that they signed. And so that seems to at least be somewhat problematic to me, that, the U.S. is now carrying out these airstrikes. Although from the Taliban statement, it didn't sound like they were wholly upset with it and saying that, oh, we're now going to retaliate by trying to target U.S. forces or something like that. But rather, they just kind of dismissed the claim by the U.S. that they were like carrying out these particularly aggressive actions in Helmand or something like that. Will, any more details on this?
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on something you said, I think it is very possible the Taliban are just trying to get some bargaining chips in Helmand, some extra territory while they're, doing these talks. Because, like, as you're saying, like, I think you've made this point on the show previously, but like at some point in the talks, they're going to have to start deciding like who has what territory, and I think they want to make sure they have the most they can bargain with before that point in the negotiations. And as far as we know, I think the talks are still at very early stages. They are not quite at like hammering out who gets what territory or any kind of power sharing or anything like that. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case. Essentially, anytime you're talking about, having a ceasefire take effect in a few days or a few months or whenever, it always seems to make both sides desperate to take as much territory as possible prior to the ceasefire, because then obviously you can't. But whatever territory you have, you get to negotiate with during the ceasefire. And so you
Right.
sometimes, especially these ceasefires that don't really last for more than a couple hours aren't necessarily beneficial. They just ramp up fighting, and then a couple hours later it dissolves and they go back to fighting. Another
Right.
interesting thing on Afghanistan that I just kind of picked up here before we went on, Will, was this interesting story. So Trump and now Rand Paul have said that the U.S. troops are coming out of Afghanistan by Christmas. And then I read today that the top U.S. general, commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, just
Yeah.
reiterated that no, it's conditions based. And so this is one of those really curious things that you've had during the Trump administration where it seems like uh, by the constitutional design, the civilian control of the military, meaning that what the president says the military does, and if he says the troops are coming home, the military, you know, organizes and plans and brings the troops home.
Says yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, right. That is not what Mark Milley said. He said, what if the conditions are right, we'll make it happen. So that was really disturbing to me. And then what even adds to it is that anytime, especially the mainstream media covers it, they kind of cover it the same way they did with James Mattis's resignation over a potential withdrawal from Syria and Afghanistan, which is, oh, well, thank God there's adults in the room to temper this insane president who wants to do all these reckless things. And boy, if it wasn't for, people like Mark Milley and then, the HR McMasters of the world to, put out the statements and, go on the cable news channels to make the case for staying, we may get this forever war really may be forever. I mean, for me, it has seemed like forever since, it started when I was like 10 years old and has gone on for, I just turned 30. So a long, long time. It seems like forever for me, but they're really trying to turn this thing into a forever war where they never leave, even if the president orders it. So I know we didn't really plan to talk about that one, Will, but I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts on the top U.S. general just essentially ignoring the president.
That's funny, actually. I did plan on I had a little bit of that on the Milley interview at NPR. I just wanted to comment on that like it didn't seem like Milley was suggesting that the whatever happened this weekend in Helmand, that it doesn't seem like he's saying that that's going to have any effect on the withdrawal. That was sort of like the take that I got from it. He did mention another interesting thing he said, and I think I've heard U.S. officials say this before, but he was asked about the Christmas withdrawal thing that Trump and I guess now Rand Paul have been floating. And he wouldn't confirm or deny it, but he did say something about how they have multiple like series of options for withdrawing, and presumably that means they have slower options that would take longer than the current plan to be out by next spring. But I wonder if they also mean they have faster options too, like maybe something more akin to what Trump is saying about a Christmas withdrawal. So like he didn't like not that he indicated that's the case, but I just wonder if like the way he worded it, that could be true, just based on the way he said it. So I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, it's just unfortunately for Trump, I feel like he's waited too long now to really pull out any troops before the election. I saw a report from Bloomberg, which was just citing an anonymous official, so I don't think it's worth going into it in too much detail. But that official said that Trump is looking to withdraw hundreds of U.S. troops from Somalia. I think there's about 700 there, so I'm not sure if that would be all of them, half of them, some of them, who knows. But even if that story is true, I think again you have the problem with just Trump not having like the wherewithal to like really go, Mark Milley, this is what's happening. If it's not done by this date, you are no longer the commander of the Joint Chiefs, and I will find someone else to do it. And that's that.
Right, you're fired.
Right. That's the way it goes. And I'm sure that he will find some general that won't get fired and will carry out his orders. You also had things like his ambassador to Afghanistan, Will Ruger. His nomination is just saying around. If Trump was really concerned about ending that war, maybe he should have the Senate be pushing to confirm Ruger, who would probably be a little less controversial and take a long time than his Supreme Court nominee, and throw in Douglas
Yeah.
McGregor with that, and get some of that stuff done on foreign policy. Also, just I think even in the best case scenario, when you're talking about a couple hundred troops like in Somalia, it's probably going to take a few months to get those guys all out logistically. I don't think the military is a particularly efficient machine when it comes to essentially anything, and so it takes a long time to get all the right ships in the right place to pick up the right equipment and stuff like that. A lot of this equipment's really heavy Humvees, and it's probably not advantageous to leave that stuff sitting around for Al Shabaab or whoever to scoop up in Somalia. And so, Trump is now, having run on his "I'm going to end endless wars" campaign, seems to be scrambling to try to put something together, like either before or leading up to the election. And it just doesn't seem like, he has left himself enough time for it to happen or have any of the right personnel in place to make it happen. And I think that'll be one that, big failures looking back at the Trump presidency, especially assuming it ends in the next several months here as he doesn't get reelected, will just be that, the guy couldn't put anything together to achieve, the promises he made. Even if it did seem like, kind of throughout his presidency, he was somewhat interested in bringing some troops home.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that he's waited till like this close to his last year in office, like to the end of his last year in office, possibly, to start trying to do, make some of this like, troop withdrawals happen. Like he does seem to be scrambling a bit. I also saw that report in Bloomberg about removing troops from Somalia, and it does seem like that would be some sort of last minute campaign maneuver, assuming that the source is legit in the Bloomberg story. But that's unfortunate. Like he's had 4 years to make all this stuff happen. He's had a great like potential picks for for personnel. Doug Bandow or any range of people from like the Cato Institute or more mainstream sort of libertarian beltway circles that he could have drawn from. And now here he's at his potentially last year in office, and he's scrambling to make some of these things happen. It's like he had the time, but he didn't use it wisely.
Well, one thing Trump did do with his time, Will, is pick a fight with China, and this was very intentional. And part of that escalation now is moving forward with at least 3 weapon sales. But actually, I read today that there were 2 more that the U.S. is moving ahead with, and so it looks like a massive round of weapon sales coming to Taiwan, which will of course upset China. One of the weapons are the high mobility artillery rocket systems. There's also long range air to ground missiles that are going to be sold, and then upgrades to the F-35 with new weapon sales. And that were, I believe Reuters reported that the White House was moving forward with today, included the Reaper drones and a coastal defense system, but basically a bunch of missiles to defend the coast of Taiwan. And so this is a serious round of weapon sales. This isn't just a couple tanks, which aren't necessarily maybe very effective, and then a couple upgrades to current weapon system. A lot of these are, again, artillery, missiles, rockets, stuff like that. And of course, China is going to be very upset about this, because the reason Taiwan is buying these weapons is not maybe to launch an offensive against China, but certainly to have the capability to maybe deter Chinese aggression, or there's territorial disputes between Taiwan and China regarding, the seas around Taiwan. And so if Taiwan's looking to maybe extend a little bit more, autonomy over those areas and control over those areas, these weapons could be important. And Will, I'll let you jump in on this, and just what do you think the maybe importance of the weapons are, why China is so upset about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a good job just like summarizing the basic facts of these arms deals. They're at various level, like stages of approval right now. We have these 3, like you mentioned, the HIMARS rockets, the air-to-ground cruise missiles. Those are made by Boeing. Lockheed makes the rockets, and then there's like these sensor pods. They're selling them for the F-16. Like it really is just a big bonanza for arms contractors, and of course the Taiwanese like this to for their whatever their chances against the Chinese. I don't expect that they're going to be in a hot war anytime soon, although that is sort of what they're preparing for. However, I think we might be talking about the same report, this Reuters report. I think they had mentioned that there are 7 major like U.S. weapon systems making their way through the export approval process, all for Taiwan right now, including the 3 that we just summarized. But yeah, apparently they're also going to be sending drones and some other kind of missiles, and also I think underwater mines as well, like to prevent like amphibious assaults, which would be how the Chinese would have to obviously invade Taiwan. And so, I mean, like we are seeing the Trump administration has sold Taiwan quite a lot of weaponry. Like, and this is like these seven like weapon systems that are about to be sold to them. That's all on top of like a bunch of other sales we've already made. I think there were like 66 F-16s that we sold them, 108 Abrams tanks, as well as over I think $1 billion in like radar systems and other missiles and torpedoes and weapons parts. And so there's been all kinds of like weapons sales to Taiwan under this administration. Previous presidents have approved them or have overseen those types of weapons sales, but Trump has been like stepping those up quite a bit. And I think that is obviously part of his administration's like I don't think you call it a pressure campaign. I guess you could call it that, but his sort of campaign of hostility toward the Chinese, which has taken place on all kinds of different fronts, whether it's trade or like hemming in certain Chinese companies or carrying out all kinds of military drills out right in China's backyard. We've covered quite a bit of that on the show. But I guess just like for people who aren't all that familiar with the situation with maybe the context of like why there even is tension between the two. And so effectively after World War II, there was a civil war in China between then the government, the Republic of China, and the communists. And by 1949, the communists won, and they kind of pushed the former rulers out, and they fled to Taiwan and basically became a government in exile. And since then, they've run this like breakaway state there, which they still call the Republic of China. And so this is like the leftovers of the pre-communist government in China. That is like what is ruling in Taiwan. Of course, though, the current Chinese government, the communists, the CPC, they see Taiwan as like still as a province of China proper, and they say it is not a separate country. And so that's sort of like a source of a lot of this tension here, this dispute between the Chinese and the Taiwanese. And the U.S. has basically sided with Taiwan in that dispute. And we sell them weapons and give them all kinds of other like rhetorical support. And while I don't think the Taiwanese have actually formally declared independence from the Chinese, that is exactly what Beijing is concerned about when they see all these weapons deals. And they see Taiwan cozying up to the U.S., not to mention the huge U.S. military presence in the region, like sometimes literally in the Taiwan Strait. We often sail warships through there. And so China sees all this stuff, and they're worried that like this will embolden the Taiwanese to declare independence someday and look for international recognition as their own country, which the U.S. would definitely be among the first to give. And so sort of that is like I'm not an expert certainly on like Chinese-Taiwan relations, but that is just like the basic situation there. That is why there's tension. And the U.S. comes down on the Taiwan side in that whole dispute. I don't have a super strong stance on like, the Taiwanese claims, but generally I do side with people, seeking independence or secession or autonomy or whatever from some kind of imperial center. But I am also very skeptical usually wherever the U.S. is trying to get involved and whatever side they're backing. So like I think you may agree with me here. Like I can respect the Taiwan's desire for autonomy from the mainland without sort of endorsing the U.S.'s attempt to meddle in that and to make that happen, to make them autonomous. So I mean that's my stance on a lot of different things, whether it's Iran or Venezuela or North Korea. I always support these people trying to fight their own governments. I just don't want to see my own government get involved, because we see their track record and it's usually a bloodbath and a disaster. And so that's reason to oppose it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Will. And just to add, it seems like the increase in U.S. weapon sales to Taiwan are correlating with an increase in U.S. commitment towards Taiwanese defense and also provocative actions against China on behalf of the Taiwanese, including, as you mentioned, sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait, which has happened at increasingly frequent rate under the Trump administration. You have to wonder if that's part of what Taiwan feels like they're buying. If you just look at a map of Taiwan versus China, realize that China has one of the world's largest economies, now one of the largest military budgets and stuff like that. It seems like if China really wanted to retake Taiwan, there's not a whole lot the Taiwanese could do about it. Certainly they could maybe set it up so that they're able to inflict pain on the Chinese mainland and try to make it that it's not worth, but if China wants to do it, it seems like just based on scale and what military power would be, they could. So my guess is that Taiwan is really trying to buy, U.S. defense commitments here. And that's just something that the U.S. shouldn't be committing to. It doesn't benefit any of our security, whether Taiwan or China or whoever the CCP controls that island off the Chinese coast. And it's hard to imagine that the U.S. could effectively fight China for that island just based on how close it is to the Chinese mainland and how far it is from the U.S. China has some pretty good anti-ship missiles. And so if the U.S. plans on, just sending over a barrage, a full fleet of aircraft carriers and destroyers and stuff like that, it may not turn out so well for the U.S. or even the people of Taiwan. And so I'm not sure, what the long-term strategy is here, other than just it seemed to be poking, the Chinese dragon over and over again.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's very like provocative and antagonizing. I guess one thing that could be done by like U.S. lawmakers to start to cut, because I think there's actually a legal commitment to arm Taiwan with like what they call defensive weapons. We were recently talking about the whole Israel thing with their qualitative military edge and how there's a law that mandates we have to maintain that. Well, it's a similar thing with Taiwan with providing them defensive weapons. So that would be one thing to start cutting against. That I think it's called the Taiwan Relations Act to start, changing this relationship.
Well, it's interesting because the U.S. also, believe, legislatively supports the One China policy that recognizes that Taiwan is a part of China too, and so we have all these kind of conflicting policies and ideas when it comes to Taiwan, and
Right.
just create a real geopolitical quagmire for the U.S. that. Likely, I think will just end up costing us a bunch of money and gain a lot of our young men killed. The last thing I'll just mention is that I think people have the idea that one of the big things that this does is creates a lot of jobs in the U.S. and one of the real advantages of it is we're selling American-made stuff around the world, and isn't that great? But a lot of the times it turns out that the job estimates from these weapon sales are way inflated and actually, far fewer than they pretend. And a lot of the times the money ends up in the hands of, the former generals or congressmen who are now working as lobbyists or board members of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and stuff like that. And it doesn't create a bunch of factory jobs or, what people imagine are like the blue collar jobs that the people of America want. So, well, anything else before we wrap up here?
Nope, I think we hit touched all the bases.
All right, everyone. Before you, close off the show and everything, just think about following me and Will on Twitter. That's where, you get all of your work. Will's a staff writer at RT. So he publishes, several articles a day, and he puts them on his Twitter handle at the Will Porter. I am the news editor of the Libertarian Institute, and I write the daily news roundup there. And I put that along with the show on my Twitter handle at Kyle Anzalone _. You can also follow the show on Twitter at con _ interest. Conflicts of Interest is on Facebook. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. The more subscribers we have, the more we could do with the channel. So if you're not listening to every episode there, check it out. But the video is really awesome, so you should be watching the show on YouTube. And last, patreon.com/conflicts of interest. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. Bye, everybody.